probably I'm going to disappoint you, because in a certain sense I'm going to say that the institutions I'll be talking about were not banks as you might think of banks. So we could begin really with two questions. Did banking as we know it originate in Italy? Well, in some respects it did. Some of the institutions, some of the types of transaction that we conduct every day were known in medieval Italy. But to be more provocative, were there banks in medieval Italy? I'm actually going to be suggesting that that's not really in any sense that we might recognise. Say, no banks, why am I actually here? No banks, but banking operations. Right? And a culture in which the making of profit was certainly widely approved of in the merchant classes, despite the fact that the church was constantly preaching against at least some types of financial activity which were classed as usury. There isn't really time here to go into the whole question of what usury was. But we have this very interesting tension between bankers, some of whom are very close to the Pope himself, and the official position of the Church, which condemns the levying of interest. We have merchants who begin their documents in the name of God and profit. We have merchants who talk in their contracts about the profit that God shall give. So it's a very interesting world in which there's a sort of, if you like, division of opinion about the validity of making money. Well, what I need to say today is based on research which, some of this research began many, many years ago, and then I actually published an article 20 years ago called The Impact of Italian Banking in the Late Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And revisiting that work and thinking about the role of the banks, particularly in Florence. That's mainly what I'm going to be talking about today. And you will hear, therefore, about the most famous bank, the Medici, but I will come up with some surprises. And one of the surprises, of course, is this idea of perhaps calling it a bank is not really as justifiable as you might assume. Right, so let me begin. And I'll begin actually about 40 years ago when I was conducting research on all these issues. And I went in Genoa to the Piazza dei Banchi, the place from which in many ways we derive the term bank, which is now, I think, there are one or two banks there. There was a big marble bank there, and I thought, well, I've got a cheque I wish to cash. This cheque was drawn on Coots, 1692, but 1692 was nothing in the Piazza dei Banchi. The Piazza dei Banchi was functioning as the place where the bankers, I'm going to use that word for a moment, operated even in the 12th century. Well, it turned out that I could do that, I could cash the cheque. And as I say, this was a financial instrument which has certainly antecedents in the Middle Ages, not just in the Christian world actually, but also in the Islamic world. So there we are, a connection certainly to the past. But there was another connection to the past which I experienced on that occasion, which was the woman in front of me in the queue. And she had brought, probably from under her bed, a pile of gold coins. And the bank clerk was testing all these gold coins to see if they were genuine, one after the other. And this again seemed to be a perfect connection back to the 12th, 13th centuries, when of course they would have very carefully assayed any gold coins that were offered in the Piazza dei Banchi to make sure that they were of sufficient quality. So, in Genoa, let's look at a picture of Genoa. There is Genoa, Nuremberg Chronicle, 1493, and actually there are bits of this which are still recognizable. We have, well, that doesn't really look like a cathedral at all, that's what it's supposed to be. But these gateways are still there, and the port, one can still make out the general out of the port of their banking would be somewhere in that sort of area. So here is the city which had a particular centre of banking. What does that mean? It means that there were benches, banking, from which people operated, with tables in front of them. So these were easily dismounted. No marble halls, as I say. The place I was visiting was one of these rather sort of overblown Italian banks of modern times. But these were temporary structures which were removed every evening. We might be tempted to think, when we look at some of the palaces of the great banking families of medieval Italy, that that was not necessarily how banks operated. Here is the palace of the Peruzzi family, which was one of the very grandest banking families, commercial families in the 14th century, early 14th century Florence, which was actually built into the Roman amphitheatre. They took over the amphitheatre, as you can see quite clearly. And it's part of Florence, some of you may know, near Santa Croce, and very famous for the ice cream parlour, Venice, which is somewhere in these back streets. They entertained the King of Naples, who we'll be meeting later, in this palace. But actually, within that space, the amount of space given over to banking activities was pretty small. Or we might take the case of the Medici Palace, which is in Florence and is best known for these extraordinary frescoes of the Adoration of the Magi by Benozzo, which shows the Medici family actually all dressed up in procession going to adore the baby Jesus. But again, this was a sign of the magnificence of the Medici family, but it wasn't really a place. It didn't function as a banking headquarters so much as a symbol of the power that the Medici operated in the city. So I've already been tripping over my tongue a little bit by using this term banking, and the first problem that we actually have is the question of the definition of terms. It's a problem which is accentuated whenever one's dealing with medieval early modern Europe. Before industrialization, we're tempted to use the terminology of modern economics, and it's unavoidable that we do so. But as you will see, the term banking has to be understood in a very sort of stretched sense. So let me quote one of the leading historians of the economy of late medieval Florence, man called Richard Goldthwaite, who says of the Medici firm, it was not a bank in the modern sense of the term. It wasn't concerned with deposits, extending loans, and therefore it makes much more sense to use a term like company or firm to describe the Florentine banks. We will come across one or two people, however, who really were what we would describe as specialized bankers, people involved, for instance, in the exchange of money, but that's only a small part of the activity of some of these Florentines. Now, in Florence or Genoa, if you were somebody with a certain amount of cash in hand, let us say, for instance, that you received a legacy from your sort of main aunt, and there was £5, which not a very large sum of money, but in those days a reasonable legacy to receive. What would you do with it? You'd invest it in some way. You'd invest it perhaps in a commercial expedition, and in the process you would expect to get a return on your investment, profits from trade overseas. But there were still these problems that kept arising about the legitimacy of making profit. And in the process, what we find is that particular individuals, I'll call them bankers at the moment, who are involved in currency exchange became very important. There's one way to dodge around some of these bans of making a usurious profit was to change the money into a different currency, and then you could argue that, well, it wasn't so much interest as it was a question of adjustment which was made when the money was returned back into your own currency. So there were various methods which did mean that types of bank, individual types of exchange banking developed within these Italian cities. And particularly important was the phenomenon of loans to groups of people like peasants living outside the city walls who might be in need of short-term cash for the harvest period, for instance. So these people would be coming into the city looking for very, very small loans. And we find that groups of people, pawnbrokers, groups like that, begin to emerge in these towns. And the most famous group of pawnbrokers, of course, are the Jewish pawnbrokers, who emerged in northern central Italy very much in the late 14th, 15th century. Before then, actually, there weren't many Jews living in that area. I'm showing you a picture of the ghetto of Venice, which is cheating a bit because that was only developed in the early 16th century, but it's the most famous example. And of course the whole point was small loans which didn't compete with the activities of the very big banks. Pawnbrokers, of course, intrinsically are involved in a very wide range of activities. So in order to redeem your loan, obviously, in order to obtain your loan, you've got to deposit some goods with your pawnbroker. So the pawnbroker actually becomes also a retail merchant in many ways. And so we shouldn't think of these people simply as specialised bankers. Now, ecclesiastical disapproval of usury had led to the isolation of these Jews into that particular role as moneylenders, which was officially prohibited to Christians. But there was also, this ecclesiastical disapproval also had a further effect, which was the emergence of competition within the Christian community with the Jewish pawnbrokers. The Franciscans in particular, the famous Order of Friars, set up their own pawnbroking organisations which were intended, by charging very low levels of interest, which were thought to be ecclesiastically legitimate, they were intended to compete against the Jewish pawnbrokers. And so we have the emergence of the so-called Monti di Pietà, mountains of piety, or in this particular case, Monte dei Paschi, mountain of the flocks, of Siena, which, as you see, founded in 1472. The building is a 19th century, late 19th century building. And you all know about Monte dei Paschi di Siena because it was founded in 1472 and is therefore the oldest functioning bank in the world, I suppose. We're not quite clear how long it will last in its current financial situation. I don't think the Italian government could, reputation-wise, I don't see how they could let it fall. But the fundamental issue that was being faced by those who were involved in banking activities was the idea that the charging of interest involved the buying of time. This was fundamentally immoral. And this was rooted, particularly in the late Middle Ages, in a very close reading of certain texts by Aristotle. I won't go into the whole sort of philosophical basis of this. But that money should not, it was unnatural for money to grow. Money simply does not grow. I mean, this is a piece of metal, and nothing can make it sprout other things. It's not an organic. It's not something that grows out of the soil. So, how do you get round this? Well, one thing you can do is, for instance, you could make a loan with a fictitious settlement date, and you could write into the contract that a penalty will be imposed if you don't pay by that particular date, but it is actually agreed, not in the document of course, that you will not pay by that date. So that way the lender does receive a form of interest. And as I say, there's also a very important type of activity which is the exchange of money, which gave lots of opportunities by exchanging currencies to obtain interest. What is extraordinary is the way in which certain groups of people popes and kings also found themselves. And this goes back in the case of the Papacy. By 1200, we already have a group of so-called merchants of the chamber, merchants of the papal sort of government, who are providing loans to the papacy. So how does the papacy get around this? Well, in the 13th, 14th century, the fundamental answer is, every now and again, right, there may be surreptitious payment of interest. But for the merchants, as we'll see, for the bankers who we'll be looking at, it's the prestige of lending to the Pope. You don't actually expect to make a profit on those loans. In fact, you often make a tremendous loss, but it's a sort of loss leader, which then enables you to do business with people around the papal court or the royal court under with the tacit approval of the papacy. The papacy is not going to interfere in the sort of business that you are indulging in. The pure banker, what about people who really do spend their time completely engaged in banking transactions of one sort or another, not just exchange, payment of interest and so on? There were one or two centres in Italy by the 13th century where this was a fairly widespread accepted practice. Not so much Genoa, actually. Genoese rely very much on bankers from Piacenza in Lombardy and Asti in Piedmont. And the reason for that was that they were often looking for credit and financial services on the routes that led across the Alps towards, as we shall see, the Champagne fairs. Now, this, of course, was part of the services that bankers could provide. The Genoese tried to do business in a place as remote as Bruges. They need somebody to provide the basic financial services for the transmission of funds, all that sort of thing. So that's where the Piacenzans and so on came into this. And in the course of the 13th, 14th centuries, we do see a build-up of the present Genoese, Florentines and others in cities as far away as Bruges. So this on this side you see the Genoese house in Bruges, which still survives in the late 14th century. You can visit it, but I should warn you before you go into it that it is now the Belgian National Fried Potato Museum. Quite serious. So before that it was a disco, so it's had a rather unfortunate history. It's very beautiful building actually. So we've got the need for banking to help sustain some of this long-distance trade, and it's this sort of dimension to maybe Italian banking that I'm going to be stressing very much later. Because the major interest of these firms like the Peruzzi, Bardi, Medici, which I'll be talking about, actually was not making money through loans. It wasn't making money through the exchange of money. What it really was actually trade in particular commodities. And the two commodities that really stand out in the case of Florence are wool, some of it coming from as far afield as England and Ireland, and grain, much of it coming from southern Italy and Sicily. So it's important to understand these banking activities in the context of quite elaborate trade networks. Let me give you an example from the 15th century. If we take the Medici Bank, in 1459, they were trading in the great fairs which were held in Geneva. They made 10% of their profits, over £3,000, from exchange transactions. But they made 42% of their profits from the sale of silk, brocade, English wool, jewellery and earth. And this is really characteristic, the much greater importance of these commercial activities compared to the ordinary banking transactions that we tend to associate with them. And historians have really, that's been rather sort of, they've rather jumped to the conclusion. There's a whole school of historians writing in the 20th century, really by constantly using the terminology of banking, constantly concentrating on exchange activities, rather neglected some of these other activities. Right, so what I'd like to do for a while is to concentrate on three of the great Florentine banks, the Bardi, the Peruzzi, and the Acciaiuoli, all of whom were active until 1343, and they actually continued after that. In 1343, there was a great banking crash, which was partly brought about by the failure of Edward III to achieve his objectives on the west of Flanders, and the enormous effect they invested a lot of money in the English crown, and also by events in Naples, where similar sorts of crises were taking place. And yet, the Bardi, at the peak of their achievement, here we have in Santa Croce in Florence, the chapel, the side chapel, which is still there. Paintings by Giotto, the greatest, who was in his own day recognized the greatest artist of his time. But the real irony of this is that what are these paintings of? This is a painting showing St. Francis disrobing himself, the vow of poverty. And what's that got to do really with the wealthiest family in Florence, you might well ask. And then, I wouldn't call them just rivals, actually they're friends, collaborators in many ways. The Peruzzi, they also have their own decorated chapel, a great monument obviously, which everybody entering the church would recognise to their wealth and distinction. And here is a portrait of a major member of the Acciaiuoli family, who actually finished his career as effective Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Naples, a very remarkable character, Nicola Acciaiuoli, and who continued actually his activities after the collapse, the virtual collapse of the family bank, by moving away from banking, because of course banking was a sort of springboard into other types of activity. It was an opportunity to become a nobleman, to break free of the sort of, as it were, upper middle class origins of Acciaiuoli. I mean, the family name meant sort of steel worker. It wasn't quite the sort of family name you wanted if you also aspired to become, as he did, Count of Melfi in southern Italy. Right, so in 1994, a retired businessman called Edwin Hunt, who you might have some readers, published a book called The Florentine Super Companies, in which he argued, as I'm arguing now, that the total banks didn't really represent the full range of the activities of these people. Commodity trading was, he said, the major preoccupation of the Peruzzi. One shouldn't just think of them as the Peruzzi Bank. And he insists that we have to think of these banking operations as being sort of surrounded by a whole range of activities. The Peruzzi, the Bardi, what they were actually doing was they were seizing particular opportunities. So sometimes they would indeed involve themselves very heavily in lending, and that could be disastrous, as actually happened in their relationship with the English king. But he says you have to bear in mind that they had all these different irons in the fire. So, I quote, he says, to focus only on specific aspects of the businesses produces results like those of the fabled three blind men trying to understand the nature of an elephant. One example of this is, for instance, a tendency to invest in real estate, which is also symbolized by the guy I was showing you earlier, where is he? Actually breaking free from their, as it were, origins and trying to become local nobility. So this was the route to something really rather better. The three Florentine banks I'm talking about therefore engaged in activities like seeking out narwhals from Greenland to northern Europe, they brought that into the Mediterranean, managing the customs dues of the ports of the Kingdom of Naples, a whole range of activities from time to time. So, what were these institutions? Can we even talk about those institutions? Because it's not permanently established banking operations. They were established by contract for a fixed period of time. There were no bond or something like that. What we're looking at is groups, generally family members, so particularly actually the Medici, very often not family members, that's sort of 15th century, who came together in small associations, not just a single association, not just one Peruzzi firm in, let's say, a long group of different Peruzzi organizations, all related, of course, to one another. And they dealt with just certain aspects of business. So, as Hunt pointed out, they didn't have any ships of their own, even though they were exporting grain from Sicily. They didn't have wagons or mules, mules being the normal form of transport to get grain across the hills towards Florence. They had therefore to turn other people, the Genoese, the Catalans, and so on, if they wanted. Ships, even the main warehouse they used in Florence was leased from other people, though those other people happened also to be members of the Peruzzi family for a time. So, every 5 years or so, they review the state of the association, they decide whether to renew the contract, they bring in new people. It's a temporary sort of arrangement. And what it's built really, it's built on, short-term partnerships are built on the sort of trust that can be created within a family network. The fundamental feature is establishing trust between the members. Now, the difficulty that they constantly faced was the problem of cash flow. Because, for instance, if you're trying to buy large quantities of English wool to get it to England, to get it to Florence, then you're tying up capital, and even when you've brought it to Florence, and you're trying to get it turned into cloth, which you don't do in Peruzzi cloth factories, you pass it on to others and you buy it back. It's a very complex set of procedures. So all of this ties up capital, and cash could be immobilized for very long periods. And this was something which led in the 1330s, then culminated in the Great Crash in 1343 to enormous difficulties. But at their peak, on the other hand, these were institutions, if I can use that term, very short-term associations, which attracted a great deal of interest among the wider public, because you could, if you deposited money with the Peruzzi at the beginning of the 14th century, you might, in certain circumstances, be able to get 7 or 8% interest on your profit, which was on your deposit, which was considered perfectly respectable. And so we get a lot of money injected by outsiders. So in this sense, we think of these institutions as something like banks. By 1300, for instance, the Peruzzi raised capital of £124,000, of which £54,000 had been injected by outsiders. So you can read that two words. You can say, well, look at the role of the outsiders. But of course, what's also very striking is that the highest portion is actually family money, which is being directed into this operation. Now, in order to understand what's going on here, we also have to understand something about politics in which these people were involved. These three banks, Bardi, Peruzzi, and Genoa, were aligned with a particular political faction. And this political faction had gained power in large parts of Italy from 1266 onwards under Charles I of Anjou, the Frenchman who became king of Sicily. And one of his very first acts, actually, even before he conquered the kingdom of Sicily, he offered various Florentine firms who were prepared to do business with him a promise that if they gave him advances to help him fund his campaign, he would give them special privileges enabling them to export grain from southern Italy and Sicily at heavily reduced taxes. Now, grain being something the Florentines really craved, because something we know about Florence in the early 14th century is it's a big city by then. It started in a small way in the early 13th century, but by the early 14th century would be, let's say, 100,000 people. And in order to feed this population, you actually needed quite a large territory, which Florence did not have. Some of its neighbours, like Siena, had larger territory than itself. So, what did the Florentines do? Well, they had to import 7/12, according to the sources we have. 5/12 of the food they ate, the grain that they ate, was produced locally. That still left more than half in a normal year having to be imported. And in the early 14th century, there were lots of abnormal years. There was all seasons, famines, and so on. So the city became very, very dependent on these outside supplies of grain. The political alliance with Charles of Anjou was part of a wider political alliance known as the twelfth alliance, which involved in particular the Papacy. It's a pro-papal alliance as opposed to their rivals, the Ghibellines. The Ghibellines who were, in a broad sense, not so much anti-papal, but generally supportive of the Holy Emperor and also of the Aragonese who ruled the island of Sicily in the 14th century. So this led to quite a sharp division, not just in politics, but also in economic activities taking place in Italy up to a point. This is one of the descendants of Charles of Anjou, Robert the Wise, who was particularly generous with gifts to the Bardi and Peruzzi, to those two banks. There is a sustained situation, and it was died in 1343 actually that the crisis occurred in their affairs as well, not just because of Robert's debts, but because of the English king's debts. Now, the Bardi and Peruzzi, however, were going to be handling operators, and while on the one hand they cultivated King Robert and they exported out of Italy phenomenal quantities of grain, free of charge, free taxes in order to feed the population of not just their cities, which they also distributed around the Mediterranean and they had surplus, but on top of that, they also dealt with Robert's enemies, the Aragonese rulers of Sicily. So they kept their options open. Even though they had a clear political preference, as the Aragonese kings of Sicily were very anxious to get rid of their own grain. And all of this is backed up with the system of loans, but it's a fragile system, as I say. It was very easy for them to overextend themselves, granting loans to rulers who were actually incapable of paying back the money. Right, so let's just look at a chart. So, let's look at this. Here is a table of the branches of the Peruzzi and Acciaiuoli compared with the branches of the Medici. And I'll come back to the Medici column perhaps later because, as you see, there's quite a lot missing. Actually, they did have branches, not necessarily in Naples, but in southern Italy. So this is based on something in the Cambridge Economic History of Europe, which is a little bit out of date. You know a bit more now. But as you can see, the branches were spread over a very wide area of Europe. The branches were run by a sort of head branch who was pretty well independent of Florence. In Florence, there was a sort of capo. There was somebody who was sort of head of the family who notionally was in charge of decision making. But logistically, of course, I mean, how on earth could somebody in Florence control the activities of the bank in Rhodes, which was actually quite an important commercial status for Cyprus, or even actually places nearer home like Avignon. So they had considerable autonomy, but it gives you some idea also of the relative size of these banks, the fact that Naples, one of the most important centres of activity, you have 8 agencies and you have 5 of the Acciaiuoli. So Peruzzi always a larger sort of enterprise than the others. Right, so, if we begin to think about the comparison then with the other major bank that everybody knows about, which is the Medici, we begin to see some extraordinary differences. The collapse of the banks in 1343 the collapse of these 3 major Florentine banks had some very major repercussions psychologically. I mean, it came a few years before the Black Death, it also had enormous psychological repercussions, but these two things together really changed outlooks very much, I think, within Florence. And it became more and more understood that if you really wanted to ensure stability in your banking operations, what you had to do was to keep things relatively small. So it's not actually so surprising that the Medici turned out to be a much smaller operation than the Peruzzi and the Bardi. People recognized that these earlier institutions had greatly overextended themselves. And so we get an enormous multiplicity of banking operations in Florence in the 15th century. Richard Goldthwaite, whom I mentioned earlier, historian of the economy of early Renaissance Florence, makes the point that actually you could write the economic history, not the political history, the economic history, not the cultural history. The economic history of Florence in the 15th century could be written without having really said anything about the Medici as bankers and traders, because there were so many others who were also in the fray at this time. One of the banks, for instance, and I will use the word bank in this context, was the Alberti, who were particularly one of their most famous members, Leon Battista Alberti, who was a famous writer, interested in architecture and so on. And he actually made some comments about the history, the nature of the banking operations of his family. And he wrote this: "Just look at the house of Alberti. As it excels in all professions, so in this one, pecuniary though it might be," talking about banking maybe, "it has flourished in Western Europe and in many different parts of the world, always with honesty and integrity. Hence we have acquired no little fame among all nations, and a preeminence not incommensurate with our merits." It's all a bit exaggerated, but nonetheless they were a well-known, very well-known bank, not just within Florence. "For in all our business dealings, no one was ever found who would permit even the slightest malpractice. We have always observed the greatest simplicity and the plainest truth in every contract, and thus we have come to be recognized as great merchants both in and outside of Italy, in Spain, in the West, in Syria, in Greece, and in all the ports of the world." Now, great merchants, so he is making this point that they're not just involved in financial transactions connected with banking, as we might understand, but they had a much, much wider set of operations than that. He's also laying a great deal of emphasis on good conduct in financial affairs, and that could be seen perhaps as a critique of some of the mistakes that have been made in the 14th century by his predecessors. The Alberti took care to avoid the mushroom growth that had destroyed in the end the Peruzzi and the Bardi. So when we turn to the Medici, the same sort of picture as what I've been talking about in the case of the Alberti. And a care not to rely entirely, I mentioned this earlier, not to rely entirely on family members, but to draw into the bank a number of people who were not members of the Medici family. However, the Medici did suffer in the late 15th century from internal quarrels within the bank, neglect at the very top by the greatest Medici of them all, Lorenzo de' Medici, who was far more interested in his political career and his cultural activities, which did lead ultimately to the collapse of the Medici by 1494. Right, so how do the banks compare when we've got these tables for the Medici? But here's another table which gives you some idea of the fact of the status of the Medici. They're actually compared, for instance, to Filippo Strozzi, another very important banking family. Same sort of assets, though they're separated by 40 years, I realise that. But what we're actually looking at is, let's say, a group of banks which by the standards of the early 14th century are moderately wealthy but not outstandingly wealthy. Right, so the Medici themselves, what sort of operations are they involved in? Again, it's very interesting to see that, as I mentioned the case earlier in the Geneva Fairs, what are they actually concentrating on? They're not just concentrating on financial transactions, they're also concentrating on the sale of goods. And a particular area which they tried to get into was the silk industry. Now, Florence in the 14th century, the early 14th century, had been the great centre of the woolen cloth industry in Italy. They had imitated the cloth which had been coming down for a couple of centuries from Flanders and northern France, what they called panni alla francesca, so French cloths. They started to imitate these within Florence very successfully, and all the more successfully when they began to acquire English wool, which was brought on Italian and Catalan ships into the Mediterranean from England. But the wool industry, for reasons I can't go into now, the wool industry went into recession after the Black Death. What did pick up was the silk industry. So this was part of a shift towards the luxury end of the spectrum. And they worked their way into that. Florence was quite successful in getting into the silk industry, but there were lots of competitors. The Genoese, for instance, also had a silk industry. Lucca had an important silk industry. Lucca down the road from Florence had an important silk industry since at least the late 12th century. And there was all this foreign silk coming in as well from Granada and Byzantium and so on. So it was a bit of a struggle. And this again helps to explain why in the 15th century the Medici are never able to achieve quite the sort of ascendancy that one might have expected given their reputation. This table, in a way, it's not terribly helpful. I mean, I have to rely on the information one can get out of things like the Cambridge Economic History here, because banking and foreign trade, so what proportion is actually profits from exchange transactions, what proportion is actually profit from foreign trade? I can't answer that question. As you see, wool shops, on the other hand, had become really rather a small part of their activity with the shrinking of the wool business on which earlier Florentines would have relied. Well, this was a period, the 15th century was a period in which lots of new economic relationships had to be formed. The Black Death had had a catastrophic effect, of course, on the population, leading to the death, perhaps, of half the population of Europe and the Mediterranean in the middle of the 14th century, and subsequent outbreaks of plague had kept the population down, prevented it from recovering from this extraordinary disaster. But one of the effects of this was this expansion of luxury business, including, as I say, the silk business. And therefore, when we look at the Medici, we can see, as I say, that perhaps they didn't take full advantage of some of the opportunities which were emerging now. Moreover, the traditional links which existed, and the Medici had their agents in Bruges and so on right through the 15th century, the traditional links which existed between Florence and Flanders, other parts of Northern Europe, were also being reduced by the fact that the Flemings, who had been major producers, as I said a moment ago, of high-quality woolen textiles, that they were going, some of their towns were not quite going out of business, but their trade was also beginning to shrink in response to these changes in the structure of demand. Well, I think I should draw to a close at this point, but the issue which I've tried to raise is how banking it's part of a whole wider range of activities. We shouldn't actually be looking to identify banks as such when we are looking at late medieval Italy. But this does not, of course, mean that there are no banking operations. And I think the problem in a lot of historical writing has been a failure to distinguish between banks as an institution and the obvious need for all sorts of financial transactions, some of them producing, against the teaching of the church, interest, which continued to be practiced within the framework of these large trading companies. And what we also see in late medieval Italy is certainly an attachment to the idea that it is acceptable to make oneself wealthy, which in a way takes one back to that painting in the Bardi chapel of Santa Croce. Here is St. Francis, who is the last person really to speak up for the Bardi, but impudently they can still put him on their walls and take pride in his saintly life. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Disrupting power of banks and the instability of banks. It's come through in your talk just now. And questions? Yes.
Did they deal in any insurance products? And did they offer guaranteed prices for grain, just offer loans and farms?
Sorry, could you repeat that? Insurance?
Did they offer insurance, and did they offer guaranteed grain prices, or did they just offer loans?
Good question. Insurance is something which, certainly by the 15th century, becomes quite widespread in the Mediterranean world. And this reflects, I think, partly a breakdown in security. So, with the increasing activity of Barbary corsairs, for instance, shifting the stuff by sea it became a much more dangerous operation. And we also hear about goods being shifted across land, which these migrant trains are raided by, given the political turmoil in Italy through Welsh and Jubilees and so on. So there's an expansion of the insurance business. When insurance really got going, there's one document from Genoa from, must be like 1190, people sometimes signalled as the first known sort of proper insurance document. It's a bit difficult to understand what's really going on in the document. But insurance mechanisms certainly did begin to develop in this period. As for the price mechanism, let me think. What the not just Florentines, other groups, what they managed to get was exemption from taxes when they exported grain or whatever it might be. The prices they paid, just thinking back to the documents, were the prices in the market in wherever it was, I mean, Barletto, southern Italy, whatever. They had to deal with current conditions, but because they weren't paying the customs taxes on the top, of course they did quite well out of this. But in times of famine, there was still worries about the way in which grain prices right across the Mediterranean were rising, and they have to cope with that as well as everybody else.
Yes, sir.
Given that there was a complete absence of
Freddie, could you get the microphone, please? Is that what?
Given that there was obviously a complete absence of electronic, telegraphic, etc., modern forms of transfer, presumably if one of these big families made a large loan to the papacy, there must have been huge transfers of coins, silver, gold, whatever, in specie, between centres. And if that's correct, I mean, how was it secured? I mean, how did they prevent banditry, etc., etc.?
Well, I didn't say very much about financial instruments, but the way that one dealt with that was indeed through maintaining accounts at each end of the operation. So you only needed to transfer relatively small sums of money between the different places. I mean, they really tried to avoid moving large amounts of bullion. So forms of bills of exchange, all sorts of things like this. There were the mechanisms that made it possible. For instance, perhaps a better example is paying for goods in Bruges, which are going to be exported right down into the Mediterranean. There were mechanisms which made sure that you didn't have to hump too much bullion around. You had to move some of it around, of course. Indeed, yes, indeed, that was the case. And so it could be quite a risky business.
Yes. Would you just pass the microphone back there, please?
Thank you, David. I have two questions. The first one, do you see the political fragmentation of Italy at that time as a positive or a negative for the development of banking institutions? And I guess there, I don't know to what extent there might be a trade-off in the shorter run and in the longer run, as you see a shift towards the Holy Roman Empire and banking developing in the Holy Roman Empire later on. And then the second question, to what extent can we draw lessons for banking today from medieval and banking, or are they just two such completely different animals that there isn't much that we can draw?
Well, to deal with the second question first, I think they are very different animals. So, what I've been trying to argue is we can trace banking back, but actually the sort of bank that we're looking at is such a sort of different alien institution. Well, the sort of firm we're looking at, I really must come back to that terminology of super company that we're looking at is so different to the financial institutions we're familiar with nowadays that it's probably difficult to draw many lessons from that. As for the first question, I think the political fragmentation certainly did act as a stimulus in some ways. It obviously meant that cities could they had their own statutes, they could set their own set of rules about various types of economic operation, not just banking, but production goods, things like this. And within the cities you had further fragmentation with guilds, the popular as it's called, often aligned against the old aristocracy and so on. And all of this this sort of fragmentation, I think, probably did stimulate it created a degree of sort of local freedom, so that individual cities were able to move in the direction that suited their own economic capacity. But thinking back, because Italy had not been a unified territory for centuries, virtually a millennium by the time of the Medici. So it's a very long history of fragmentation. I think what one could say is that if you were to compare north and south, in southern Italy, in Sicily, in the two kingdoms which vied for control of the south, actually the banks that developed there tended to be the branches, the thing I was talking about, the branches of the North Italian banks. And we don't really see the development of serious sort of banking activities in the south, apart from pawnbroking, which developed in the 15th century as the Jewish pawnbrokers came down from the north and began to settle in the south. But that's a rather sort of specific case, catering to, as I said earlier, catering to the more sort of impoverished part of the population. So I would say that the city-state was a good environment in which this sort of institution could develop. But I should also stress, and it's a very important point actually, that groups like the Peruzzi and the Bardi basically conducted their own foreign policy. They were, as I've indicated, aligned very much with the King of Naples, the House of Anjou, the Papacy. But the government of Florence was not always so inclined. I mean, there were ups and downs. Sometimes the Florentines actually fell under the rule of other groups, the Ghibellines, for instance, their rivals. And the Bardi and Peruzzi were powerful enough, if you like, and as a family group had the sort of coherence to be able to carry on doing business outside the framework of Florentine politics.
So, yes.
I may actually bring it back to the same 2 points.
as you were speaking there, I have to say I was struck with the similarity to the current financial institutions we find ourselves with. Maybe not if one defines it as a bank, if one takes the broader financial services industry which we find ourselves today. I was actually struck by the similarities and the fact that if one takes some of the bulge bracket banks, for instance, today that are using their own balance sheet, they're also gathering money in from investors, through pension funds, etc. One finds today some of the big banks also trading commodities and things like that, including grain, incidentally, but also many other ones as well. So actually, I was struck by the similarities of today rather than seeing some vast difference. Of course, they have dropped the manufacturing and the other aspects. Of course, Adam Smith told us that it's best when it comes to things like that to specialise. I guess that's the reason why. But then on the second question, and this is why I come back. I'll come back and rephrase it. I made the second of the two questions we've just been having. Why Italy? Why not the Netherlands or Flanders? Why not southern Germany? Why not Spain? Why was it that it was Italy that created that spark?
That's a good question.
That's a very good question. As for the first part, I mean, I don't know that much about the current state of the world of financial services, so I was probably avoiding Victoria's question as much as the other. But I would say that the characteristic of these Italian banks of being short-term associations, 3-5 years, 5 years perhaps at most, their flexibility in the sense that they will pick up one type of economic activity and then drop it very rapidly. But we're dealing with very narrow time frames. They'll look at, they'll try their hand at silk and then decide that's not particularly profitable. It seems to me that when you compare that to established institutions which have legal liability and so on, it is a different sort of institution. But I'm prepared to accept that. So why Italy, however? This, I think, is partly to be understood in the context of the heavy degree of urbanisation which took place in medieval Italy, but that takes one to the other part of your question. Why not Flanders, which was also heavily urbanised? Why not parts of Germany, which were heavily urbanised compared to the rest of Europe? And Flanders indeed was a very major centre of industry in this period, but less active. Its merchants were much less active than the Italians, who ranged right across the Mediterranean. And this is partly bound up with politics in the Central Middle Ages, issues like the Crusading movement, which opened up new markets in the East, which the Genoese and Venetians were very keen to exploit. And why the Genoese and Venetians? Well, and the Florentines later on as well. Well, if you just look at the cities themselves, Genoa without a hinterland, Genoa with no resources other than rocky mountainsides that produce olive oil, basil, pine nuts. So what are we talking about? Pesto. They produce pesto. You can't grow grain, or not much of it around Genoa. So these were cities which had to reach outwards in order to develop their economic activities. Venice, much the same. They had salt, they had fish, but they didn't control very much of the mainland, so they tended to go downwards. Then this had a sort of knock-on effect on the cities in the interior, some of which also, because they managed to develop things like cloth industries, metal industries, in the case of Milan, were able to feed into these Genoese and Venetian networks. But it is very striking how, particularly in northern Italy, Lombardy, Tuscany, we have this very rapid expansion, so-called commercial revolution taking place. But we also embraced southern France, places like Marseille, Montpellier, and Catalonia by the 13th century, Barcelona, Tarragona, and so on. So it's actually quite a wide arc. But no doubt about it, the Italians were the pioneers. And I'd say at the heart of this, there's a sort of question, well, Italians so much engaged in some pioneering trading activities across a very wide space, whereas Flemings so much engaged in industrial activity without actually making an enormous effort to go out and sell their goods, waiting for people to come to them, as it were, so rather more passive in their approach.
Philip Kay, historian of the Roman economy, on the right there, and also Rome's economic revolution, and a contribution to part 2 of the history of capitalism.
I'll now ask one question. David, I just want to come back to the question you asked at the beginning about how do you actually identify a bank or these banks. And I think a useful factor to take into account is the legal and regulatory environment in which these institutions are operating. And certainly, unlike today, there was virtually no regulatory environment. It's very similar to what happened in the Roman world. Also, there's very little legal control of these banks. If the Jews misbehave, they're kicked out. But in fact, there is probably some form of contract law operating, the lex mercatoris and things like this going up and down the routes through the champagne fairs. But I think my own view is that that explains why it is very difficult to define these institutions as banks, because no one actually categorises them into banks. Professionals who are operating within these institutions eventually develop them into the things like Monte Paschi and Siena. But that at the early stage where you're talking about where the Medici are operating, their trading houses, they own things, they borrow money, does it really matter whether they're banks or not, their finances?
Well, and I would add to that when things go badly for a particular individual, like we've got members of the Strozzi family, rivals of the Medici, and so inevitably being rivals of the Medici. Remember, the Medici were quite thuggish in their politics. So, Filippo Strozzi gets exiled, goes off to Naples, he sets up his banking activities there. So, the best documentation we have about banking in Naples at the end of the 15th century is actually about this Florentine banker, or whatever you want to call him. They can just, all of that is easily transferable. If they can get some of the cash out of their home city, then they can be set up somewhere else. And given the short-term nature of these partnerships, it's quite easy to do.
Tim, question here. Right up there, France, Frederick, please.
Thank you. You said at one point that lending to the Pope was a lost leader. Just using to the modern banking parts, what was the total wallet of the Pope that you looked at? And many banks today would lend to companies and expect to lose money, but they would see their customers as being very valuable because of other ancillary business.
Yeah.
And then for a posh answer to the earlier question, why Italy? Wouldn't one answer be because of the huge tribute that was paid by churches all over Europe that needed to be transferred to Italy? And indeed, couldn't one trace the profound success of the Medici to the point at which they got the Pope's wallet?
This sort of thing came and went. So, for instance, when the papacy discovers the alum mines of Torfa 1464, then you have the Genoese who come in and they service that particular activity. And Florentines are also involved at some point in that as well. So yes, but coming back to this question of the transfer of money, I mentioned very briefly through the Mercatores Camera, the merchants of the papal chamber, and that is of course how a lot of the banking activity linked to the papacy really. So we have Mercatores Camera in London, transmitting money, and as I said, the transmission of money isn't simply sending your naked bullion, it's also a question of using financial instruments to get the money across Europe. That's a very important sort of activity. Now, the papacy, of course, it's a question of getting access to the papal court, it's a question of getting access to to the Pope's ear. It's a question of influencing the papacy so that he continues to support the ambitions of the black Guelphs. All that sort of thing, it's worth paying for. And if you make a loan, you would hope to get the capital back. May not, but you would hope to do that. In the case of the King of Naples, it's a parallel sort of thing, where we know that the nobility they were not exempt from paying interest. There were ways of squeezing the interest out of them. So, getting through to actually a large body of customers. So it is quite close to what you're describing, where sort of trying to create goodwill is at the heart of the operation. Yep.
And gentleman back, Freddie, right at the back. So if you could raise your hand.
Thank you. To what extent did the banking families try to influence the papacy by buying the papacy or by having members of their own families become pope? And can you think of any analogies with later history?
Like God's banker.
Well, it's certainly the case in the late 15th, 16th century, and the Medici become very much involved. It's the Medici Pope. So, yes, I mean, obviously they began to aspire to all of that. The problem that sometimes arose was a certain amount of disparagement these families might face about, well, what are the true origins of the Medici? Actually, the Medici were not of such modest origins as often claimed. They were sort of petty nobility or something like that before they became powerful in Florence. But the argument that they weren't really one of the grand historic families, unlike some of the papal families were being elected around the same time, families from Genoa and elsewhere. So, yes, trying to, using their funds to try to buy not just political influence, but the office itself. And using their funds, coming back to the case of Nicola Ciaoli in the 14th century, to buy the highest possible offices in individual states. And not just in Naples, we've also got in England, because in the 14th century, a number of Italians who rise very high, very influential in court circles, and again in the 16th century at the English court. So they're very well aware of the potential there. Spain, another example, the Genoese were particularly influential in Spain, which created a great deal of antagonism against the Genoese. So they are willing to sort of try and buy political positions of all sorts, culminating, as you say, in the papacy itself.
Let's gather around a couple of questions here. Once on the third row from back there, wait until the microphone and waiting attendant is brought back.
I'm just wondering how the bankers priced risk in those days, because how the bankers priced risk in those days, because the political situation was always unstable, there were shifting alliances, and it must have been a very difficult thing to do.
A very, very difficult thing to do, and this word risk does appear in documents way back already in 12th century Genoa, which are the earliest documents that we have. They were very aware of this, and a lot, I'm not talking so much about banking operations, but just general commercial activities. The whole question of who should bear the risk was something which it was actually governed partly by sort of Roman law, but they were conscious that somebody had to take the blame when things went wrong. So the sleeping partner, the one who's actually sent out the agent to trade on her behalf, is the one who will bear the risk. That was generally understood. But actually calculating risk
was something I think they were very bad at, and that helps to explain why the Bardi and Peruzzi experienced this dramatic collapse in 1343. They were investing in English kings' campaigns in Flanders and northern France. They were, in that sense, sort of meddling in politics in a faraway country, basing themselves on an established friendship, but also reports which probably underestimated the likelihood of the English king failing. It was a very big gamble, and the result of the gamble and failing was people started withdrawing their deposits and so on, and everything imploded.
It's always an exciting moment to see a new intellectual landscape unfolding before one, a new kind of historical treatment of a subject appearing, and especially so being in the company of David Abulafia, as that happens this evening. He was a fellow of the Erasmus Forum, and I'm very grateful to him for coming along and giving us this magnificent launch to the history of banking project as part of the work of the Erasmus Forum. During these summer months, we are launching 4 research programs. We've had our account from Nick Crafts and from Victoria, both of them fellows in the forum as well, as an introduction to our theme of States in Trouble, which was an account of 1967, Summer of Love, and all of that, and the big question of productivity, low productivity, which is now returned to the British economy. And David now launching the history of banking on the 21st of September. Master of Law College in Cambridge, Williams will be here to launch a Reformation Consequences. It's the 500th anniversary, of course, of the penning of those theses to Judge Lord Wittenberg, and we'll be looking over a period of time, 18 months, I think, at the political, social, and economic consequences of Europe's greatest and longest, deepest divide, question that's cultural and economic as well. A version of David's talk will be published on the website or in the bulletin later on towards the end of the year, and this will happen to, and this will be featured in the case of all of those who are contributing to these 4 research projects. 4th one is Indigenous Cultures, which will come on stream, I think, in October, and that's the work which we're doing with the 6th forms, as I say in my old-fashioned way, or years 11 and 12 of the Paris Academies, work that's started as part of the Cultural Prosperity Programme and now carries on as part of the work of the Erasmus Forum. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to interpose myself between you and your cocktails anymore. But I would like to thank David very much indeed for coming on this evening and launching us in style on this terribly important question, too important really, banking to the left of bankers. Thank you very much.